Hello and welcome to the Tough Girl Podcast, a 3-time award-winning show that aims to motivate and inspire you while increasing the amount of female role models in the media, especially in relation to adventure and physical challenges. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. If you're passionate about adventure, challenge and learning from women who have overcome obstacles and achieved remarkable things, then this is the podcast for you. Every Tuesday at 7 a.m, new episodes go live featuring incredible women who share their stories, insights and tips to help you achieve your dreams and goals. You can support the Tough Girl mission by signing up as a patron. Visit Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl Podcast. Keep listening until the very end as I share more information about what's going on with me with Tough Girl Challenges, give shout outs and recommend other Tough Girl Podcast episodes. More information can be found at toughgirlchallenges.com.
I am Sarah Lonsdale. I'm a journalist, writer, historian, and I also teach journalism to undergraduates at City University of London. I've been a journalist, for longer than I can possibly remember. I think I started my first job in a local newspaper in 1988, so that gives you an idea of how old I am. I'm living in the middle of very rural Kent, about 6 miles south of Canterbury. And I'm very excited because I've just put solar panels on my roof. And that means that our massive electricity bills hopefully will come down a little bit.
Did you grow up down south? Were you, are you like sort of a country girl? What were your early years like?
I was brought up in Cambridge. My dad was and still is actually an academic. He taught history at Trinity College, Cambridge. So I was in a very bookish academic environment in Cambridge. I've always loved the countryside though. One of the best loves for me is whatever the weather, however bad I'm feeling, if I go out for a walk, it can be sleeting, it can be hailing, it could be snowing. It always makes me feel better, particularly if I see wonderful landscapes, mountains or rivers or lakes or the sea. And so actually after I graduated and started work, I actually moved down to Whitstable on the North Kent coast. And that's where I brought up my 2 kids. We were literally 5 minutes walk from the beach and they grew up running around on the shingly beach, getting sore feet. And just having that freedom of having that endless horizon, which I think is so brilliant for the soul.
Did you always know that you'd want to be a journalist, or was there like some like spark, or did something happen at some point?
I always loved telling stories. I've always written, even when I was very, very small and could first start to write. I remember my parents brought me a little notebook because I just loved writing stories and I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And so I think it was quite an obvious choice for me. I wanted to tell stories. I do remember very clearly, as I say, we were quite a sort of bookish family. I remember Sunday lunchtimes sitting at the table and we all had a newspaper in front of us. And I remember reading the Observer newspaper actually and being particularly impressed by the way it sort of campaigned for things like social justice and the rights of, the less well off and things like that. And I remember thinking to myself then, I'd like to work for this newspaper one day. And actually, I did manage to do that. So in 1990, I got a job writing for the Observer newspaper, which was kind of a dream come true, really.
When I think of history, I've probably seen quite a few memes or something on Instagram or heard what's the phrase, it's his story, and that often the unacknowledged or where are the women's voices in history, they're not mentioned. I'm obviously not a historian, so I haven't put across in the exact way what I'm thinking, but hopefully you can understand what I'm getting at. But was there a point throughout your education, throughout your passion for history, when you started, I suppose, questioning more where are the women's stories? Where are the women's voices? Why aren't we hearing from women?
Oh, yes, very much so. And also not just in history, but in, those great myths that we read about, the myth of the epic of Ulysses, and all those kind of historic stories where it's the great male hero, King Arthur and his knights. The great male hero goes off into the wild and does amazing things and fights dragons and all that kind of thing. And there's usually a princess somewhere locked up in a castle waiting for him to come back. I think it was also, for me, being a girl in the 70s and 80s, we were very much still, a lot of good changes have happened since that time, although, we have to keep pushing back all the time. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Trump's America at the moment, undermining women's rights. I had two brothers and a sister, and I was very much aware that the ambitions for me and my sister were lower than those that my parents had for my brothers. They were, my parents, absolutely wonderful people. They were just products of their time, really. And at that time, people didn't think that girls could amount to very much. I was very much aware of that, and I had big dreams. As I say, I wanted to be editor of the Observer newspaper at the age of 16. So I had big hopes, big dreams, and I didn't see many role models, women role models out there for me. And of course, history back then and even now really is about great men. It's about the kings. It's about the generals. It's about the princes, about the great adventurers. And yes, women were very much not there. And I did very quickly feel that there was unfairness in the way that the system was constructed, against our being able to achieve the dreams in the way that young men were able to achieve their dreams.
Oh, do you know, it sort of breaks my heart, when you hear that, like, and especially just around the role models and, girls won't amount to much, and almost like all the things that you said, and we're still like fighting, fighting against it. And you just keep thinking, things will change, things will get better. Everyone's working on their little niche. For me, with the podcast, and I focus on women's adventure stories and getting their voices out and sharing their stories. And I think we're up to like 750, 60 episodes, which is amazing. But I love what you've done, because you've really, well, actually, start with your first book, Rebel Women. Would you like to share more about Rebel Women and writing that book and how it came about and what that process was like?
Rebel Women was very much about women writers who weren't able to kind of have a platform for their writing in the same way that men could. And I focused on them because obviously as a writer, I'm very interested in women's writing and what they do. And obviously, one of the big things about history is that you can dig around and you can, when women's voices are absent, it's not that they weren't doing anything. It's just that we just don't know what they were doing. Very often women's writing never got published. It was private. It was in letters and diaries. Or if it was published, it was never in the big mainstream newspapers like the Times or the Guardian. It was often in very niche publications. And as a woman writer, I wanted to find out some of their stories, find out these women who did, and a few women did manage to break out and go on adventures and do things. I wanted to find out how they did it. And one of the reasons for that was I'm not particularly brave person. I get scared easily, and I get put off from trying to do things I want to do too easily. And I know that's a kind of a fault in me, probably partly to do with being brought up in the 1970s, but maybe just my nature. I haven't got the heart of a lion like some women have. And I wanted to learn from the women I was investigating and writing about, how they managed to break through when so many other women couldn't. And I wanted to investigate women who weren't well known, not the Virginia Woolfs, not the Simone de Beauvoirs, not the Jane Austens that we all know about, but I wanted to bring out the women who we've heard less about. So, for example, I studied the life of this amazing woman called Sheila Grant Duff. She lost her father in the First World War, and she grew up without knowing who her father was, and determined that she should do everything she could to prevent there from being another war that would take away other people's fathers. She was very bright. She went off to Oxford, and all her male colleagues at Oxford University who wanted to be writers, they just walked into jobs at the Times, at the Guardian, at the Spectator, in the way that in those days, sort of elite young men with a degree from Oxford could. But she went to see the editor of the Times and said she would want to be a foreign correspondent because this was 1934. Hitler had just come to power. She was terrified of what he might do. And she wanted to tell the world, warn the world of what was going on. So she went to see the editor of the Times, and he literally said to her, "Sorry, mate, you can't because you're a woman. We don't have women foreign correspondents." And that outraged her. She was brave, and she was quite, I wouldn't say reckless, but she sometimes didn't put her safety first. And she went off to Paris on her own. She told him she was going off to Paris on her own, and he said to her, "Well, in that case, why don't you send us some fashion notes about what ladies in Paris are wearing?" Which infuriated her more. But anyway, so she went off. She was freelance. She wasn't part of this very tightly knit, quite elite group of male foreign correspondents. And she went off. She reported on a referendum that was being held in a bit of northern France that had been part of Germany before the First World War. And there was being a referendum held whether it wanted to return to Germany. This was early 1935. And she was the only foreign correspondent who, when she saw how so the Germans won that referendum and it went back to being part of Germany, she saw the cruelty and the viciousness meted out on people who opposed returning to Germany by the SS, by the Nazi sympathizing police. And she wrote about it, and she warned everybody, look, this man, even in victory, is a brutal man who will repress people. And she was the only one who warned that. And she spent all those years between 1935 and the outbreak of war warning everybody, when most people didn't want to know that this man Hitler was bent on a vicious war. So she was just so courageous. A woman on her own in 1930s Europe. I wouldn't have done that. So I wanted to study her and other women and how they had the courage to break out of these dreadful stereotypes and make something of their lives.
God, it really is incredible. Just these voices and these stories that we don't hear, and actually getting the woman's perspective, the woman's viewpoint on what they're watching, what they're seeing unfold. Oh my God, I can feel like my stress levels rising.
So to counter your stress levels, what I would say is what she did, and then what other women journalists like Martha Gellhorn did after her, was because they were women and therefore they were outsiders, they didn't get access to the politicians, to the generals, to the chief of police. So they interviewed the women. They interviewed what was called by Louise Bryant, who was an American journalist at that time, the odds and ends of war. So she talked, and Martha Gellhorn talked to the ordinary people and told their stories about how they were being affected by these massive clashes, these global conflicts instigated by these big tough men. And so she did bring out the women's voices in a way that hadn't really been done before.
Tell me more about your research and how you researched this. Was this during the COVID time?
So I started researching rebel women just before COVID. In fact, I had to stop when the British Library closed down. But actually, Rebel Women was published in October 2020. So most of my research had been done by the time COVID struck. It was a tricky time, and I was at that time thinking about my next book, wildly different. And a lot of that, again, I had to find online resources and things like that. But I think I'm a bit nosy, and I think that's why I'm a journalist too, is I just love I managed to find quite a few of these women's private diaries. either through their very, very lovely and helpful families who kept them in their attics and things like that. Or, for example, Sheila Grant Duff's diaries are kept in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And just to go and sit there and read these letters and these diaries of these women from 100 odd years ago, you get so close to them in a way that you can't just by, I don't know, reading a biography or something like that. You really get to find out what makes them tick, what makes them cry, what makes them sort of passionate or angry. And so, yes, I've spent many a long hour digging through various archives, getting headaches and sore eyes, but really finding I connect with these women across the years in a really kind of direct way.
I love that. It sounds like it's like, being like a detective, finding these bound books in an attic, someone's private diaries that have just been, been looked after, but maybe looked over, or no one sort of realized the importance, or no one brought out their stories of these women doing incredible things. So how did you go from Rebel Women to Wildly Different? Was there a process, sort of a thread that links them? Obviously, women and women's stories and women's voices, but what was the sort of the link?
Rebel Women was all about women in the spheres of journalism and politics, particularly. Although one of the women in Rebel Women was this mountaineer called Dorothy Pilley. And I chose her because back in 1921, she and some other women climbers founded the world's first feminist climbing organization called the Pinnacle Club. Now, believe it or not, opinions of women climbers were so low in those days that women weren't allowed to go climbing in places like the Alps without a male escort. They were thought to be incapable, really, of hauling themselves up ropes and things like that, even though they're much lighter and possibly more nimble than many men. And as part of the Pinnacle Club, Dorothy Pilley was also the editor of the Pinnacle Club journal. And it was a journal devoted to women's writing about the wild, women's writing about climbing mountains and nature, and provided this platform for women writers that no other had not existed, in terms of here was a public platform that women could write about their relationship to the rocks they were climbing, to the rivers they saw, to the challenges that they faced. And I kind of fell in love with Dorothy Pilley because she was a bit like Sheila Grant Duff. She was so brave, not only in terms of facing up to the very elite, very snobby, very patriarchal climbing community at the time, to say, we will climb, and we will climb without ropes, and we will take our skirts off and wear breeches, even though you don't like to see our legs. That is what we are going to. So she was very, very brave in that respect, but also some of the climbs she did were incredible. So she was in a party that made the first ascent of the northwest ridge of the Dent Blanche in the Alps, which was considered to be almost unclimbable because about 2/3 of the way up that mountain, you have to sort of shimmy upside down along an overhang, which is about 3,000 feet above thin air, and then kind of swing up over. It's like a sort of the bridge of a nose, and then literally climb up about 300 sheer feet before the slope starts to kind of even out and it's a bit gentler. And the only way you could do that was by springing off the end of an ice axe, literally into thin air. And I read her diary of that day that she climbed that mountain, and I thought, she said, I was shivering with fear. I was shivering with cold. She was wearing her gym shoes, but she just gritted her teeth and did it because that's what she loved to do. And so when I finished Rebel Women and I wrote about the Pinnacle Club journal and all the amazing writing by women in it, I kind of felt that I hadn't finished with Dorothy because she was such a fascinating woman. And I I thought, well, if I've done a book about women writers and women involved in the sort of the public world of politics, then why don't I write also about women and the great outdoors? And the more I looked at this sphere, the more I realized that women were absent from the wild just as much as they were absent from the kind of world of politics. And I remember very much when I was a little girl. So my mum was lovely and read to me all these stories, but they were stories, I'm sure you all remember them too, that if there were heroes, they were men, and off
Mm.
they went to rescue princesses. And if there were girls in them, like Little Red Riding Hood, if they strayed off the path, bad things would happen to them. And there are all these myths. So Ulysses, King Arthur, there's the myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the first story ever written down, which again, it's in sort of old Mesopotamia, thousands of years old, and it's another epic myth about a brave king and his male companion, and off they go on self-making quests. And the only women you find in these landscapes are either kind of supernatural goddesses, or if they are human women, flesh and blood women, they're often there because they've transgressed in some way. You know, they've been kicked out of their village, they've been kicked out of their city wall because, I don't know, they had a baby outside of wedlock, that kind of thing. So these very strong myths telling women throughout time that, you know, if you want to be respected, if you want to get married and have children, you stay indoors, you stay inside, you don't go out adventuring. That is a landscape for men only. And the more I looked, the more I realized that there was something that needed to be written about here. And then I remembered a story that my mum read to me when I was very little. I don't know if you've read it. It's called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. And I remember sitting next to my mum in this little pool of light, you know, outside of which there were trolls and dragons lurking, and she would read to me. And this story, East of the Sun and West of the Moon, was about a hero who left their village to go and rescue somebody, but the hero was a young girl, and she left her village on the back of a polar bear to go and rescue a prince who was being held captive in a castle a long way away. And she and the bear roamed these great ridges, these great mountains and forests across northern Norway. And she kept saying, shouting out, I am not afraid, I am not afraid. And she really stuck with me. And I asked my mum to read that story to me many times. And it wasn't until I was older I realized why. And it was because she was about the only girl in a story that I'd been read who was the one who went out and did these extraordinary things rather than it being a brave knight or a brave herdsman or a brave king, that kind of thing. And so I thought I would find out how and why women were able to break these very strong taboos against, you know, leaving the safety of the home, the village, the castle.
Do you know, it's so fascinating. It almost starts from such a young age. And, you know, you're talking about myths. I remember, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, it probably got popular on TikTok, but about Medusa being
Oh,
misunderstood.
all these monstrous females of myth, they're all creations of, I'm afraid, a sort of patriarchal
Yeah.
mindset, which says that, you know, these monstrous women are there for sort of brave men to sort of stand up to. It's a really strange world, isn't it? Where this kind of myth is constructed so that the only women out there in the are sort of for men to challenge like that.
Yeah. I think it was like the Odyssey. And there was another one which was translated by a woman as part of her PhD program. And when and she was the first woman to translate it. And when she actually did the translation, because all the rest had been done by men, it was like almost like not a different book, but a different slant on it. Instead of the women being called certain derogatory names or something, it wasn't translated directly like that. So it was quite sort of a, what's the word, revelation about it, like
Mm.
having a woman's perspective, like by a woman doing the translation, and how things can be translated in different ways to, well, I suppose it's like editing, to, to edit things in a certain way. To compare it to modern day, it'll be like how reality TV shows are edited, so you get a certain viewpoint, you're not getting the full picture.
I'm very excited by what you say, because obviously all history up until quite recently was male authored, told by men. And one of the areas I looked into was I wanted to go back as far as I could into ancient history to find out whether there had been women, obviously, because there are hunter-gatherer societies, even to this day, that live in the wild. But even then, it's the men who go ranging much further afield for the big game, whereas it's the women who often stay quite close to the compound and they tend the forest gardens, and maybe they trap rabbits and things near the village. So I wanted to go way, way back in history, and I looked up some research on sort of very early hunters, where they hunted with spears rather than bows and arrows. So spear technology was before bows and arrows were invented. Now, with a spear, you have to have pretty much the whole village is required to, say, bring down a woolly mammoth or whatever, because spears aren't very, you can't aim very well, and they're not as powerful as arrows. And back then, young girls could throw a spear just as well as a young boy. And so you'd have everyone in the village involved in this activity. Now, they found the graves of women hunters dating back thousands of years in places like Central and South America. And they found these women surrounded by the kit that you need to kind of gut a woolly mammoth on site. And for many, many years, male archaeologists dismissed this and said these women couldn't be hunters because women weren't hunters. They just assumed women weren't hunters, and therefore thought it was just, maybe it was just a kind of ceremonial, symbolic grave good, that these tools that were surrounding their bones. It's only much later now it's been established that women were hunters, and that now they've reassessed some of this archaeological evidence that these graves weren't just symbolic. These women were actually, great hunters as well. But again, it's about who gets to tell the story, isn't it?
It's fascinating. And the Pinnacle Club that you talked about before with Dorothy Pilley, I love the fact the Pinnacle Club is still around. Like, it celebrated its 100th anniversary. So it's in North Wales, which isn't too far away from me, but it celebrated its 100th anniversary like a couple of years ago. And I think it's just fantastic. Such a fantastic club and organization in terms of just to encourage women to go rock climbing and mountaineers, and to pursue those passions and those interests, and for women to support other women in them. How many women were you researching? Because you narrowed it down to 5 women in wildly different, but there must have been hundreds.
There were dozens and dozens, I would say, that were potential candidates. And so I narrowed it down. How did I narrow it down? Well, I wanted the book to be a journey across the 20th and 21st century. And obviously, over the time of that period, sort of from about early 20th century to the early 21st century, our relationship and our knowledge of the wild has changed enormously. So back in the sort of early 1900s, it was all about sort of exploration. There was a lot of, colonial exploration going on and conquering countries and that kind of thing. And then as you go through the century, our relationship with the wild changes, and we are its biggest foe. Instead of the wild being this sort of dangerous place full of high mountains and fierce animals, we are the species that is diminishing the wild, that's chopping down the forest, that's polluting the rivers. And so I wanted to, in the later part of the century, I wanted to find women who were part of the sort of more the conservation and the environmental activism process. So there was that. I wanted to find a woman who sort of represented different parts of the time scale I was looking at and different ways we engage in the wild. So my first woman is a Canadian explorer called Minna Hubbard. And then I have a entomologist, the bug hunter, Evelyn Cheeseman, who was the first woman keeper of insects at London Zoo. Extraordinarily interesting character. And then Dorothy Pilley makes a reappearance because I love her so much. And then we go through to the second half of the 20th century, and I have this woman called Ethel Haythornthwaite, who was instrumental in getting the Peak District designated the first national park. And then finally, I end up with Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan woman who was part of this movement to plant 30 million trees across Kenya and then sub-Saharan Africa in an attempt to try and reverse the environmental degradation and the deforestation that had been going on there. So they span the world really, from sort of Canada, Europe, Africa, and also through Evelyn Cheeseman's activities down into the sort of South Pacific. But also they span all these different ways that human beings engage with the wild.
It's just incredible. Thank you so much for writing this book and promoting this book and sharing these stories. And so the book is being published published March 3rd. March 4th. March the 4th. It will be available for people to buy. And I'm sure you absolutely hate this question, and apologies, but I have to ask it. Are you working on another book?
So I am, but it's quite a boring textbook this time, actually. Well, I shouldn't say it's boring.
What? Is it a textbook about women?
So I teach at City, I teach journalism history, and it's a textbook. I'm trying to, as with all bits of history, journalism history is all about great men, the great reporters, the great press barons and all that kind of thing. And I'm rewriting the history a bit, and to bring in, for example, the women of the American Civil Rights Movement, the women journalists of the American Civil Rights Movement, and looking at the history of why, for example, when we read history in the media today, it's all either about, so the only foreign country we really know anything about is America. We don't know anything about other parts of the world, really. I mean, the last time we heard Sri Lanka on the news was because a monkey had got into its electricity grid and shut the whole country down. Now, that's not a very good representation of what Sri Lanka is as a country. And so I'm asking why these the news flows around the world, and it's all to do with imperialism and the way the great powers developed undersea cable technology in the early 20th century. So I'm trying to inject a bit of difference into journalism history. But in terms of a new proper book, a sort of history book for general readers, I'm just mulling a few ideas over at the moment.
Two questions really. What's your sort of writing process? Are you sort of writing every day? Do you wake up at 6 and you've got to do a minimum of 2,000 words, or you've got to write for an hour, whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense? Are you more go with the flow? And how would you handle like writer's block?
Oh, great question. So I think something happened to my brain during COVID. I'm not nearly as agile minded as I used to be, and I can't really work that long. I find I get tired or my brain gets mushy very quickly. So I have to be quite disciplined. And I now know that the first 2 hours of every morning are kind of the best bits of my brain. That's the best my brain can give me. So if I can sit down at my desk, say at 8:30, and if I can write 400 words by 10:30, I think that's a good day. And that's what I did with Wildly Different. I would write 400 words a day. It's not very much. It's very slow and painstaking. But I find certainly after lunchtime, my brain is good for nothing apart from doing a bit of reading and that kind of thing. So I am very disciplined just because I know if I don't do those first 400 words, those first 2 hours every morning, I'm not going to get anything done at all for the rest of the day.
And then is your reading, like the reading and the sort of the research, is that sort of what you do outside of that writing time?
Yes. So as I say, I can write in the early part of the morning, and then I spend the rest of the day doing my reading. Going. So if I've been to an archive to read diaries or take notes of diaries or photograph diaries, I'll do that. I'll do the work of transcribing my notes or transcribing the photographs I've taken, because it's dull, tedious, but you don't need much of a brain to do that. It's fairly automatic. So I do that kind of thing in the afternoon, ready for the next 400 words of writing in the following morning. So yeah, that's a kind of pattern that I found that works for me.
So, Sarah, I'm going to ask you a really difficult question here, and I feel as if all the questions I'm asking you are really difficult. I feel super mean even asking it. But did you have a favorite? I know Dorothy was a particular favorite, but out of the wildly different women who are, reclaiming nature in a man's world, did you have like a sort of a personal favorite story that really sort of resonated with you?
Um, I did actually. I mean, so I loved them all. I loved them all for different reasons. I loved the way, for example, Wangari Maathai kept on fighting, even though she faced imprisonment and physical assault, because she knew it was the right thing to do. And I loved Minna Hubbard for going off into the Canadian wilderness, the Labrador wilderness, even though everyone told her she was crazy to do it. But I have to say, my very, very favourite was this woman called Evelyn Cheeseman. She was an entomologist, so she loved hunting for bugs and she loved animals all her life. She wanted to be a vet, but when she applied to the Royal Veterinary College back in the early 20th century, she was rejected because she was female. But she persevered and persevered. And in 1917, she was the first female keeper of insects at London Zoo. But it was the First World War. There were rationings going on. And the original keeper of insects had left it and gone to fight in the trenches. So when she arrived, so excited that finally she could find work to fulfill her love for animals, she arrived at London Zoo to find that there was one aquatic beetle in the aquarium of the insect house, nothing else. So she spent her summers with her butterfly net and her collecting jar, going around the sort of countryside of England, finding things to put in the zoo. But after the war, of course, people were very bored of looking at tadpoles and mayflies. They wanted something a bit more exotic. So she managed to go on a scientific collecting expedition off to the islands of the South Pacific, to Tahiti and the Galapagos. And there she started a 40-year career of insect hunting. And she got into all sorts of scrapes. So on an island called Gorgona, funnily enough, named after one of the Medusas, because it was full of snakes, she found herself trapped in a giant spider's web for hours and hours, and she just couldn't escape until she discovered, tucked into the hem of her jacket, a little nail file that she used to kind of saw her way out of these incredibly strong skeins of spider's web. And she went to the island of Molecular, which is part of the Republic of Vanuatu, and she made friends, even though she was told by the then kind of English resident, it was part of an English settlement, that she shouldn't go there. He didn't think that women scientists should be allowed. She went anyway, and she made friends with the local native tribe. And the king of the tribe asked her to select a gift to send to her king, King George V. So she selected this enormous spear, which he had parcelled up and sent to the king, only to find the staff at the palace decided, before the king was presented with this enormous spear, that they should check it over a bit, only to discover that the tip of the spear was poisoned with strychnine. And so she had accidentally sent a poisoned tip spear to King George V. And she went on collecting and examining right up until her sort of 60s and 70s. And she just loved what she was doing. She worked hard. She was meticulous. About 200 different species are now named after her. But because she was working and living in the time she was, she didn't even get a paid job at the British Museum Natural History where she was working, and she had to borrow one of the men's microscopes in his lunch break to use because she couldn't afford one of her own. So she was just so determined and so hardworking and conscientious, but she did make extraordinary discoveries throughout her life.
Just so many amazing women doing amazing challenges, and just, thank you so much for sharing their stories. And how can people connect with you? How can they follow along with your writing? Where are you most active?
Well, I'm active, pretty active on Blue Sky. I used to be on X, but I couldn't bear it any longer, I'm afraid. So you can find me at sarahjlonsdale.bsky.social. And I love posting about all sorts of things from politics to mushrooms. So you can find me there.
Fantastic. I will make sure that I include the links to your social media and to your books as well, so that people can read these incredible stories and to also support the work that you are doing, which is so important. Like, just getting women's stories and women's voices out there is just such a priority in my view. And Sarah, I'd love for you to have the final words, final words of advice and wisdom from what you've learned from doing all of this incredible research on these amazing women, for other women out there who maybe do want to live wildly different lives, who want to pursue their passions with determination and to live a different type of life, apart from just do it. What advice would you like to share? And you can take that in any direction you'd like.
Well, the first thing I would say is ignore those people who say, you can't be doing that. You shouldn't be doing that. I don't think you're the right person to be doing that. Just ignore everybody. Everyone's full of prejudices. I mean, I was talking to some of my female students yesterday. I sort of asked them, have you ever been told you shouldn't do something just because you're a girl? And these are young women. These are women of 18, 19, and about half a dozen of them put their hands up and said that they were told specifically that they shouldn't want to be a journalist, that they shouldn't be interested in politics because they were girls. And these are young women in the 21st century. So women are still being told that you can't do these things, and you just have to ignore them. And sometimes you have to pretend. I found it very easy to try and do things just to pretend that I wasn't who I was. So, as I said, I'm not particularly brave, but I've done some pretty brave things, I think. I was the first girl in my newspaper newsroom when I joined, and so the news editor called me Bert. And I did follow my dreams, and I just put on this kind of pretend cloak of courage in order to bring people up, in order to send that email, in order to make that introduction to somebody. I find it works really well. You sort of just pretend you are a different person. Pretend you're Dorothy Pilley, or pretend you're Evelyn Cheeseman, and say, I'm not putting up with this, and I'm going to do this, because if I don't follow my dreams, I'm always going to regret it.
Absolutely. Sarah, thank you so much for following your dreams. Thank you so much for writing these incredibly inspiring stories of these amazing women across both Rebel Women and also your most recent book, Wildly Different, which is released on March 4th, 2025. Thank you again for coming on the Tough Girl podcast and sharing more about their lives. It's been so, so inspiring.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been wonderful talking to you. You're a great listener.
Hey Hey, tribe. How are you all doing? It is now the beginning of March 2025. And how is everything going with you? I hope you are training hard. I hope you, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, I hope you're enjoying like spring. The skies are definitely getting bluer. It's lighter in the evenings. The weather is starting to get a little bit better. Like I feel as though I've got through those dark, horrible months and we are on, I don't know, the right path now, the path to summer, which is definitely what I want. Everything's good with me. Mini update. I'm hitting PBs in my strength training. So I've been back strength training now since I started properly sort of beginning of October. So October, November, December, January, end of February, 5 months in. And this past week, I PB'd in my bench press, like 50 kgs, 82 kilograms in my back squat. I got 105 on my hip thrusts, which I was really pleased about. There's just a couple of them. And I was just thinking, why am I getting so many PBs? What is happening? And then what I've realized is I think I'm like I've been weightlifting for like 10 years or strength training for like 10 years, but actually I've had a good 18 months off. So I'm probably back in like the newbie phase. And so in your first like 6 to 12 months, like your body's starting to adapt quickly. And I have started with like a really, really solid program, which is fantastic. So I'm hoping that I can eke out these gains for like another 4 or 5 months or so. My recovery is also so much better now. My sleep is on point. My nutrition is getting there. I'm resting well. I'm obviously doing loads of stuff at AIM Health. So I'm doing cryotherapy on a regular basis, red light therapy, hyperbaric chamber, which is when you infuse your body with oxygen. I'm doing a rebalance bed, compression trousers. I have a red light bulb in my room. I've got red light at home, which is so great. I'm also taking Zinzino now, omega-3s. I will be tested again in about another 2 months' time. So about 60 days, I'll be tested to see how that's improved. I'm really consistent with my training. So I'm training like 4 times a week. I am doing progressive overload, which is absolutely fantastic. And I know that my technique and form is getting better because I do work with a personal trainer and our gym is really dialed in for that. So I do feel as though I'm lifting well. Just wanted to share that with you. What else is new? That's pretty much it for me at the moment. The vlogs from New Zealand, they're coming to an end. So I think the last vlog went live yesterday. So finishing the end of the Te Aroa Trail in New Zealand. If you haven't watched those vlogs, go and watch them now. I'm going to monetize them soon. So probably by the end of this Friday, I'll put ads on and try and start making some money from them. But obviously, because it was a sponsored hike, I didn't monetize the vlogs when they came out because Zolio was sponsoring that hike #challenge with Zolio. So if you haven't watched those, do you know, I honestly think it's one of the best series I've ever done. I'm so proud of what I've created and what I've put out. I'm still trying to figure out how to turn it into some sort of documentary or some sort of film. I'm having some chats with some people to see if there would be of any interest. I'm still not sure if I've necessarily got a story for it yet, but I'll figure that out. But if you've got any ideas or you think, oh, actually, Sarah, I've got some ideas or I think I could help you with that, then please do reach out. Sarah@toughgirlchallenges.com. It'll be great to hear from you. But I hope all your training plans are coming up well. I hope you're starting to get some plans in the diary for what you're going to be doing over the next couple of months. It's always really great to have a goal to be working towards, whether that is an adventure goal, a personal goal, a financial goal, a work goal, a relationship goal. Have a goal, write it down. You are more likely to achieve your goals if you physically write them down and put it on a piece of paper. So if you haven't done that today, please do that today. That is your job for me, is to write down your goals for 2025. What are you going to be achieving? I should have started yesterday, but I just couldn't do it. I'm going to start upping my training for the GR10, which I'm going to be taking on in August. So I need to start building up on my endurance, but that will come. I've still got quite a few months to go, so I don't need to do anything at the moment, but it's going to make that hike a hell of a lot better if I am fitter and have some endurance, because the elevation gain and loss is pretty impressive. If you're brand new to the podcast, wanting to learn more about me, wanting to learn more about the incredible women that I interview, then please do visit toughgirlchallenges.com. On the website, there is a resources section, and if you want to read more or hear more stories about incredible authors, poets, journalists, bloggers and writers, there is a dedicated page on the Tough Girl website related to these incredible women who are out there writing their stories, putting pen to paper and just sharing and writing about their lives and what they're doing. There's, God, to be honest, I'm just scrolling through now. There's probably like over 30 interviews with different women who have written and shared more about their life. So please do go and check it out. Please do support women, authors, podcasters, vloggers. Women supporting women is honestly one of the most powerful things that we can do. So please do pay it forward. Big thank you to all of the patrons who are paying it forward for me to help allow me to produce this content. We're working towards 800 episodes by August. 800 episodes. 800 stories. I mean, to honest, like, well, maybe not 800 stories. There will be 800 stories, but about, 15 of them are going to be me. So 785 stories about women from all over the world doing a whole variety of different adventures and challenges, just sharing their stories about their lives, what worked for them. Please do go back and give it a listen. All of the content, to be honest, is evergreen. You can listen to episodes from every single year and you will learn something from these incredible women. Big shout out to the patrons who are allowing me to do this work. Your support means everything. Having a regular income at the beginning of every month makes such a big difference and just takes the pressure off me when I have to pay all of the bills to keep the website up and running and the running costs of hosting a podcast. If you'd like to support the work I do, then please do visit Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl Podcast. All that's left for me to say is wherever you are, whatever you are doing, give it your all, give it 110%, get after it, go for it, believe in yourself because I believe in you. Take care, lots of love, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.